Ji, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome everybody to the PIDE webinar. Or should I say this is a joint PIDE PPAF webinar. My name is Nadeem Ul Haq, welcoming you to the PIDE PPAF joint webinar, Unpacking Poverty and Poverty Graduation. Well, that's a wonderful theme. I'm happy, would love to learn more about this. PPAF, as you all know, is Poverty Alleviation Fund, which has been there for a number of years and done some very good work. And I hope Qazi Azmatisa is here. We should welcome him too. He's the head of PPAF, and PID is an old think tank. And so it's good to see this collaboration. We are all always seeking collaboration. We always want collaboration. I think the research community can only grow with collaboration, otherwise it can't. So this collaboration is most welcome and most, happy. So let's begin the webinar. I will bring in Dr. Nasir Iqbal, the Dean at PIDE, and himself a poverty researcher, a well-known figure in poverty. Nasir Iqbal engineered this whole thing, so I will ask him to introduce the session to you and to moderate the session. Nasir Saab, go ahead.
Thank you so much, sir. Really, this is a very innovative webinar creating based on whatever we have already done and the learning from the experience of PPF and especially from the international community. So I'll just start with the key notion that our founder father said, that we have to create a happy and contented people, a contented society. So yet after 7 decades, our planner failed to create a happy society due to these multi-dimensional deprivations ranging from monetary poverty to social poverty and institutional poverty. And if we look into the real number, more than 50 million people face income poverty, especially they are very shock sensitive due to their livelihood strategies linked with the insecure livelihood patterns. Similarly, around 75 million people are facing social poverty in terms of education and health, and around 50 million people also face environmental poverty. This brings us to the question for the whole discussion that we are hoping today with our expert, that how we can break this vicious circle of poverty and create a happy society where everyone can feel that we have enough resources to live a decent life. So in the previous, we have invited Professor Ben and Professor Banerjee to give a very lively discussion on how we can learn from the international experiences. And building on the Breaking Out of Poverty Trap webinar that with the Nobel laureate Abhijit Banerjee, this webinar basically look into closely how the poverty graduation program basically work in globally and especially in Pakistan. More specifically, the webinar aims to unpack what defines live poverty and how current poverty graduation model like National Poverty Graduation Program run by the PPF, and also the very famous example of the BRAC model that is also on the same foot. So in this webinar, we are also aiming to see the key issues that our presenter basically will dig into these issues, how we can ensure the key challenges those are attached with the graduation model. To me, there are 2 or 3 key issues. One is the scalability of these models. If we do experiment at a very small scale and we fail to expand it at a very large scale, then what would be the efficacy of these models? Then effectiveness, and last, the sustainability of these efforts that these graduation model put in to break this vicious circle of poverty. Because if we look into the recent example of this pandemic, there is a massive evidence that there is exponential increase in poverty, and our evidence from 5 various studies also show that the poverty is increased from 45 million to around 60 million. With this background, we have a very learned the panelists for this webinar. Today we have 3 panelists. Dr. Shujaat, the labor economist, currently is working with PIDE, and previously he was heading MNE, being one of the largest social protection program in Pakistan, namely the Benazir Income Support Program. He has a vast experience in looking into the poverty and poverty dynamics. The other is we have Professor Imran Rasul with us. He's one of the distinguished professors working at University College London. He's co-director of ESRC Center for Microeconomic Analysis of Public Policy at Institute for Fiscal Studies. And he has a vast experience in terms of conducting research, not only globally, but in Pakistan. Currently, he is working with PPAF to experiment new models to innovate in this graduation strategy. And the third panelist, we have Ms. Samia Liaquat Ali Khan. She has worked in the field of human rights and development for the last 20 years with experience in Pakistan and overseas. She has successfully led regional and global development teams and programs which incorporated right-based approach to poverty reduction. So with this, I'll invite Dr. Shujaat to give a brief introduction. What are the economic opportunities that we see are available for the poor, that we can use different graduation programs to reap the benefits. So over to Dr. Shujaat.
Thank you, Dr. Nasser. Am I audible? And I think my presentation will also be shareable.
Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So, respected colleagues, Assalamu alaikum and good evening. The purpose of today's webinar is to focus on reviewing the poverty graduation models. And as Dr. Nasser have mentioned, that we have two distinguished speakers, Ms. Samia Liaquat and Dr. Rasul, that have wide practical experience, because Ms. Samia is associated with PPAF, and PPAF have more than 2 decades experience on poverty graduation. So I will attempt to initiate a discussion that where we are standing at the present and what we should do to modify the poverty elevation programs so that they can bring a real change in the life of poor and marginalized segments. So these changes should be sustainable. I will raise certain questions that may help our distinguished speakers to enrich the ideas that how we can modify our poverty elevation programs. And since I worked at BISP for more than 5 years, so I will talk on certain issues that right now our social protection programs are facing in terms of sustainability as well as scalability. So firstly, why we require the poverty eradication programs? Because you know that right now, almost all the low-income countries, they are replicating poverty eradication programs, and there are social protection interventions. So there are 4 major reasons. That's why we require the poverty models. The first is redistributive purpose, to uplift the poor and marginalized segments, because resources are not evenly distributed in the low-income countries. So there is poverty and there is inequality. So objective of all these social protection and poverty graduation models is to promote resilience, equity, and opportunity among the poor households. Second, the major challenge is that right now in low-income countries, including in Pakistan, we lack competitive markets. So these markets have certain distortions, and that's why they are disproportionately affecting the poor and marginalized segments. And second, we don't have insurance programs. Like in developed countries, they have health coverage, they have insurance. So right now we don't have. So that's why these distortions in the markets, they motivate to initiate certain social poverty eradication interventions. And third, you know that in low-income countries, including in Pakistan, we have a lot of shocks, like health shocks, like food inflation. So that's why basically hamper the poor peoples to accumulate their soft as well as physical assets. So aim of these programs is that let's build the asset accumulation. And fourth major promotion is that let's change the behavioral and household bargaining powers. Like in Pakistan, we have quite limited women labor force participation. We have certain women empowerment issues like education, access to financial inclusion. So that's why BISP started to give cash, and all BISP interventions have a major focus on women. So these are main four reasons. But as Dr. Nasser have mentioned, that poverty, the measurement of poverty is itself a debatable in Pakistan. We have various forms of poverty. And our official methodology to measure poverty is consumption based. But the challenge is that there is a mixed nexus between growth and poverty in Pakistan, where in some periods, even we are facing a declining poverty, even in low income growth period. For example, if you look at 2007 and 2010 period, there was sluggish growth, there was high inflation, there was worse law and order situation, but poverty significantly declined. And same in 2008 episode, when we have just growth below 2% even, still poverty is declining. So still it is a debatable that how we define the poverty. So before explaining this poverty graduation strategy, I want to highlight that the empirical evidences suggest that poverty cannot be alleviated only through micro interventions like cash transfers or microfinance. So most of literature in Pakistan, it mostly focus on government initiatives like social safety nets, microfinance, employment, etc. But this debate mostly ignore the most enduring way out of poverty, that is self-help, as Dr. Banerjee said 2 weeks earlier. So dependency of the poor on any form of assistance can lead to their social as well as economic exclusion. But the self-help to happen, there must be an opportunity. And PIDE hold a series of webinars on street vendors, urbanization, that how opportunity can be created for the poor. So our poverty graduation strategy should have 3 pillars. First is this sustained growth that create productive jobs and economic opportunities. Second is investment on social inclusion to ensure equal access to economic opportunities. So we have to invest on education, we have to invest on health and other productive services that can build human capabilities and create opportunity for the poor. And third could be the social safety net, that to protect the chronically poor and offset the adverse impacts of shocks. But right now, in Pakistan, we are relying a lot on social protection initiatives as well as microfinance initiatives as a tool for poverty alleviation, without giving much weight to macroeconomic policies like sustained growth, social inclusion, etc., etc. Dr. Rasul may correct me that Bangladesh's growth is propelled by conductive macroeconomic policies, where the government invested heavily on expanding and improving economic infrastructure and human capital. And it has developed the industry as the backbone of the economy. And then microfinance has supplementally contributed to mitigating poverty. So alone, social safety nets or social protection programs might not be sufficient to alleviate poverty. So here we are facing that right now. We don't have a sustained growth. You know that we are in a demographic transition phase where we require 7 to 8% growth to absorb this influx of youth, but we don't have the growth that can create job opportunities. Similarly, we are facing certain challenges on social inclusion. You can see on this slide that we have severe dropout rates. Look at Balochistan, where net enrollment rate at the primary is just 35% for women to female, and it is just 17% at middle and only 9% at matric. So we have certain areas where we have pockets of poverty, and we don't have education, we don't have certain capabilities and opportunities that can create opportunities for the poor. And then we have a very weak transition from education to employment. For example, in this slide, you can see that I have explored it from the labor force survey that only 7% of the young women, they have completed education. And less than half, they have transited to labor market. Only 47% of them, they have transited to labor market. And 49% those who have transited to labor market, 49% are unemployed. So that's why our education, on one side we have a weak quantity of education, but on the other side we have a weak quality as well as certain labor market issues where we don't have decent jobs. So these are the challenges which we are facing. So now we have the third pillar on which I will focus, especially in terms of scalability and sustainability. That before 2000s, we have need-based interventions, and still we are running these need-based interventions like Zakat, like Battlemark. In 90s, we started social action programs, but again, spending on these programs was compromised. So formally, we started social protection programs in early 2000, like you can see poverty reduction strategy paper in 2001. And then we have microfinance initiative like PPAF was emerged in 2001. And then there was a strategy, National Social Protection Strategy that was emerged in 2007, and this was emerged in 2008. And recently, the government has established a well comprehensive ISAS strategy that was implemented in 2019. And similarly, we have certain provincial social protection programs like Punjab have established Punjab Social Protection Authority. Similarly, KP government is implementing in Scorecard, and some other provinces also have some sort of social protection programs. So good. So right now we are focusing and we are trying to resolve our education and livelihood challenges through the social protection programs that alone might not be helpful. For example, this is the ISAS strategy that is trying that through social protection programs, we will improve human development, we will improve livelihood and jobs, and we will improve governance, etc. So it might not be sufficient. So on this slide, we have certain scalability and sustainability challenges. For example, in this slide, you can see that BISP has invested a lot of amount on unconditional cash transfers. So there is one stagnation that BISP was merged in 2008, but still we are relying on unconditional cash transfers. We have less innovation. We have limited capacity to improve programs. So that's why still you can see that after 9-10 years intervention, still a lot of people, for example, you can see this slide that 88% of the BISP beneficiaries, they were poor in 2011, and 73% of the beneficiaries are still poor in 2009. So it means that despite of spending lot of amount, more than 700 billion rupees, this has not succeeded to reduce poverty. So it could be one challenge that we lack a certain group of programs mixed with unconditional as well as conditional cash transfers that can graduate the people out of poverty on sustainable basis. Second, we also have, so right now, I think that financing on social protection is not a big issue in Pakistan. When BISP was started, the budget was just 34 billion. And when People's Party left, it was 70 billion. And when PMLN left in 2018, it was 125 billion. And right now it is more than 200 billion. So right now the challenge is that how we can scalable these programs and we can sustainable these programs so that they can promote equity, resilience and opportunity for the program. So right now we have certain issues. I will highlight these issues through this by this slide. So first, we have mostly the donor-driven interventions with limited indigenous capacity to design the programs. In BISP program, donors have around 7-8% financial contribution. But mostly these donors quote the examples of Latin American countries like Chile, Mexico, Brazil, where the social protection initiatives have significantly contributed in poverty alleviation. But the real problem is that our regulatory environment and institutional framework is entirely different to these countries. So, for example, in Chile, they have 100% compulsory health insurance. We don't have a health insurance. So that's why this is the first challenge, that we are highly dependent on donors, that how to design the interventions with very limited indigenous capacity to develop initiatives according to our needs and circumstances. For example, we have the poverty scorecard survey. This is the data that have been extensively used by all the social protection programs of the country. But in 2009-10, BISP conducted this poverty
you may
scorecard.
conclude in a minute because we have
Second is the targeting issue. That we don't have the reliable data of targeting. We have a static registry. This registry was updated in 2010-11, and still most of the programs are using this data. Second, as I mentioned, that all the social protection programs, they are using this data, but since this data is not updated,
you can conclude.
So that's why grievance is a major concern. Another issue in the targeting is that which group for which sort of interventions. As I have mentioned earlier, that we might require a combination of UCT and CCT interventions. But right now, we are offering micro finance programs even to those people who are ultra poor, and also those who are quasi poor having score of 40, etc. Another issue is the coordination.
Can you conclude in a minute, because we have short time for Imran Rasul?
Yeah, I will conclude in a minute. So another issue is the coordination. For example, I can give you one example that right now our social protection authorities, they are working in a silo mode without contacting with public sector implementing our arms. For example, we have the Sehat Sahulat program. Right now, it is a good health insurance program. I can give you the example that, for example, in AJK, 100% of the household, they have health insurance. But this health insurance card cannot be used in government hospitals. So it means that the government hospitals will be useless, because 100% population, we are encouraging that they will go in private hospitals. Similarly, we have most of our interventions where the federal government is making interventions, we don't have the involvement of provincial governments. So that is another coordination issue. And the major challenge is that for the service delivery, we have absence of local government that can be used to implement these social protection programs in Pakistan. So I would request our honorable speakers that let's have a discussion that whether too much relying on social protection initiatives for poverty alleviation without limited weight to the macroeconomic policies would be fruitful or not. And second, whether our ongoing poverty alleviation initiatives, particularly the social protection programs, how we can make them helpful, that they can promote equity, resilience, and opportunity. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Shujaat, for giving a very elaborate presentation on the graduation framework and the policies at the BISP. Now, without any further delay, I will request Professor Imran Rasul to explain how we can basically break this poverty circle and try to create a happy and contented society. Thank you, Professor Imran, for giving us a valuable time.
Thank you, Nasser. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to be able to present some results of a collaboration I've been engaged in with PPAF for almost the best part of a decade now. So let me just talk through some of the findings that we have, comparing alternative models to promote the graduation of the ultra poor out of poverty. And I'll touch upon some of the issues that Shujaat also discussed on his slides when going through this. So the design of social protection programs, we know, is sort of a key issue for many countries, not just in Pakistan, but many of the other contexts that Shujaat also described. And Abhijit Banerjee and sort of co-authors of myself have contributed to suggest that providing asset transfers to the ultra poor may lead to very high returns to those individuals. And in a long-standing evaluation we've been conducting in Bangladesh, we're finding that the provision of asset transfers to the ultra poor in those households allowed them to permanently move out of poverty, as measured 7 to 10 years later. In fact, in some of our latest work in Bangladesh, we've gone back and started to interview the children of the original recipients to try to measure some of the intergenerational impacts of asset transfers and document improved outcomes for children in terms of education and their subsequent labor market choices. But in this evaluation that we've been conducting with PPAF, we wanted to compare and contrast those types of large-scale asset transfer programs to the provision of large-scale unconditional cash transfer programs. And so there's a growing evidence base to suggest that just the provision of cash may be as effective as trying to provide transfers in kind. And so what we want to do in this study, and I'll present the evidence on this now, is to compare household responses to the receipt of those in-kind asset transfers versus what happens to the ultra-poor households if they obtain equivalent valued but unconditional cash transfers from a policy intervention. And ultimately what I want to try to answer in this set of slides is, are both policies equally likely to enable the graduation of the ultra-poor out of poverty? And we're going to do that on a large scale, tracking close to 20,000 households over a long period of time. We've been tracking these households now for close to 7 or 8 years. And so we're going to evaluate these two interventions using the gold standard of a randomized control trial, as you would have in a medical study, where a subset of villages will be randomly assigned to receive asset transfers to the ultra-poor households in those villages. A random subset of villages will have the ultra-poor there be provided with an equivalent valued unconditional cash transfer, and then the pure comparison between these two groups and a control group of households who receive neither intervention would allow us to scientifically say precisely what was the causal impact of those interventions on a whole range of economic outcomes for these households. And so in our first set of villages where we provide the in-kind transfers, that's essentially providing a bundle of assets and skills to ultra-poor households. Those assets are typically in the form of livestock, although we do also offer them some small-scale retail assets as well if they choose. And for each type of asset that's provided, there's a complementary set of skills training that's also provided to that household. So it's a combination of both physical and human capital that's being provided in those in-kind asset transfers. The value of those transfers is close to 62,000 rupees as measured in 2014 prices. So this is not a small transfer. You can think of this as a big push transfer, because as Nasir and Shujaat indicated, when households are in poverty, typically they've been there for a long time. And so small adjustments are unlikely to cause them to permanently move away from poverty. We need to start considering these types of big push interventions. So that's our first set of interventions, those kinds of large scale asset and skills transfers to households. In our second group of villages that look identical before we intervene, we offer ultra-poor households the equivalent valued unconditional cash transfers. So we provide them with essentially 62,000 rupees to say, spend as you wish. You can use this for consumption, you can use this for investment, you can save it, you can choose to do with it or whatever you wish. And obviously, as Shujaat was suggesting, economic theory would suggest that if we have perfect markets and neoclassical decision-making, then it's always going to be preferable to provide an unconditional cash transfer over an in-kind transfer, because the unconditional cash transfer can always do at least as well as the in-kind transfer. And the extent to which these two interventions lead to different outcomes for the ultra-poor tells us something about how well markets are functioning in these contexts, and also tells us the nature of decision making that might mean households respond differently than if they're aided in cash versus if they're aided in kind. And that's sort of the intellectual basis for why we want to compare these two types of social protection program. It helps us to learn about the economic environment these households reside in to help us design future policies more effectively. But from a policy perspective, these are two reasonable and realistic forms of social protection program that are being discussed and implemented around the world. With unconditional cash transfers, here we're having a direct horse race between those two types of intervention. Okay, so just to give a little bit more detail about how the interventions work, in all villages, in both treated villages and control villages, we first conduct an entire census of all households. That census in our current sample covers about 250,000 households in the villages that we've been looking at. So this is a large-scale project on which we can estimate very detailed impacts on villages as a whole. We then construct a 0 to 100 poverty score for each household based on a whole variety of different assets that they may hold. And eligible households, ultra poor households, are those who have a poverty score of between 0 and 18. In the villages in which we're operating, about 30% of households are classified as being ultra poor according to this criteria. So about a quarter to a third of the village will be receiving transfers in this form. And then in order to determine which assets we provide to ultra poor households in each village, we first conduct a market assessment to see what might be the most profitable types of assets and training to provide to households. We then offer households in the in-kind transfer treatment, essentially a menu of assets and complementary training, and households can choose multiple asset skills bundles from that menu up to a value of 62,000 rupees. In the second group of villages, the T2 villages, households are faced with the same choice, but there's one more listed option, which is at the end of the menu of assets and skills. They can also, or rather they can choose the equivalent valued unconditional cash transfer and then choose to invest that themselves as they wish. Our study takes place in 4 districts in Punjab. We have about just over 100 villages in our sample, as I said, corresponding to about 250,000 households who are resident in these villages. So what do households actually choose? So in the first set of villages, where households were only offered a combination of assets and complementary training, we see about 60% of households choose some form of productive livestock. About another quarter choose some draft animals. Less than 10% choose retail, and very few households choose assets off the list that we're provided related to crop farming. So the vast majority, 3/4 of households, choose a livestock-related combination of assets that are provided. And then in conjunction with that, there'll be some specific training that's provided to households. The most commonly selected asset bundles are of the following types. You can see it there at the bottom there. In our second group of villages, where households are given the same choice of assets, but in addition, are given the potential to choose the same value of cash, over 96% of households prefer cash over assets. Okay, and they choose that initially. We then go back to them 2 weeks later and say, now that you've discussed this, are you willing to change your mind? And very few households change their mind. So households preferred to us that when offered the choice between cash and assets, they would prefer cash over assets. And so these are the 2 sets of ultra poor households we're now going to be following over time. Those who chose asset transfers in treatment 1 when offered a menu of assets, and those who preferred to take cash over assets when given a choice of both. These households are identical initially. The only difference between them is that one has chosen cash, the other has chosen some combination of asset transfers. And then in the rest of our study, we then follow these households 2 years later 4 years later, and we're currently trying to look 8 years later to understand what happened in the long term to these. Now, for those households who took the cash, we asked them, what do you plan to use this cash for? More than 3/4 of the households who take the cash say that they will invest this in some kind of livestock-related business activity. About 20% of them say that they'll invest it in some kind of non-livestock related business activity. So when provided cash directly, households do state the intention to use that for productive investment purposes, typically related to livestock or some other form of business. Households don't say that they want to use the cash for other types of investment, such as education, nor do they say they want to use the cash for fixed expenditures, such as rituals or purchasing household assets. So in that sense, when we're providing households with cash, they're very much initially stating that they would try to replicate what was happening in the other group of villages where they were only provided assets, that these households are going to use the cash to then purchase assets. The question is, do they actually do that, or does their behavior deviate from their intentions? And so let me show you the overall impacts on labour market activities, what the ultra poor are doing, impacts on the total earnings that these households have, which will be a very direct relationship between that and graduation out of poverty. And then the final results that I have in the interest of time just relate to consumption, which again will give us an indication of whether these households are graduating away from poverty. So one interesting aspect here is that I always want to make a distinction between what men are doing and what women are doing. Both spouses are typically impacted, but not necessarily in the same way from these types of interventions, either because they're not both involved to the same extent in livestock related activities, or they both might not have equal say in how cash is spent in the other treatment arm. So if we look at men, for example, and on this axis, what I'm showing you are the different types of activities, labor activities that men could be doing. So this is focusing on the extensive margin. And these are the estimated effects of the program in comparison to the control group who received no intervention at all. What were the 2-year impacts of the in-kind asset transfer? What were the 2-year impacts of the unconditional cash transfer? And then the 4-year impacts are highlighted in slightly darker colors. So what you'll see is that across the board on these margins, the 2-year impacts and the 4-year impacts are quite similar, and they're very similar between the in-kind asset transfer and the unconditional cash transfer. For both types of social protection, we find that men are less likely to be economically inactive, so they're less likely to be unemployed, moving into the labor force. They're reallocating their labor, so they're much less likely to be engaged in casual wage labor, which we know has very low returns and very volatile returns. And they're much more likely to reallocate their time and be more likely to be engaged in livestock rearing. And that's true both 2 years later as well as 4 years later. However, one noticeable difference here is that you'll see that households who receive the in-kind transfers are much more likely to have switched into livestock-related activities, whereas those households who receive the unconditional cash transfers do switch into livestock-related activities, but not to the same extent. Okay, there's a slight leakage there that although they had very high intentions to use the cash to purchase livestock, not all of them end up actually doing so. And it's not that they use this for other forms of self-employment. They're just investing this to a slightly lower extent than our households who are given asset transfers that can only be used for that purpose. So that's the story for men. For women, we find a very similar pattern, that women, the impact on women's unemployment is more dramatic than for men because women's labor force participation is low to begin with. Women are not engaged in casual wage labor, so the movements into livestock rearing are coming from the fact that they were economically inactive and now are starting to engage in economic activities related to livestock rearing. And the same for men, they're much more likely to do that if they were given social assistance in the form of asset transfers than in the form of an equivalent valued unconditional cash transfer. And there's just a small impact on other forms of self-employment. You'll also see that the 2-year impacts are quite similar to the 4-year impacts. We're not seeing much evidence that these types of social protection programs tend to fade out over time. They're having large and persistent impacts over this time scale. Next margin is in terms of how much time they spend on these activities. So what we're seeing here is that when we look at the total amount of hours spent working, that rises both for men, that rises by a greater extent for women, and therefore as a whole, household aggregates are also rising in terms of total labor supply. And again, we're seeing increases in labor supply being greater if households are given in-kind transfers rather than if they're given cash transfers, especially for men. So if we're thinking of attachment to the labor market and working as being an effective tool to get out of poverty, that's been nudged further forward with the in-kind transfers, especially for men, than the cash transfers. And that matches what I showed you in the previous slide, that in-kind asset transfers are much more likely to cause households to reallocate their time towards these productive livestock rearing activities than are cash transfers. What impact does this have on total earnings then? Well, if we look at earnings coming from employment, these are just the percentage changes from in-kind transfers after 2 years, in-kind transfers after 4 years, and then from the cash transfers after 2 and 4 years. You can see this, there's a slight increase in earnings, which is slightly higher from the in-kind transfers than the than the cash transfers. But both of these impacts are being sustained 4 years out. The magnitude of the change is between 10 and 15% increases in monthly earnings from employment as a result of these types of social protection program being provided. That rapidly leads to a large share of these households moving out of the poverty threshold and therefore graduating out of being ultra poor. Okay, the last result I'm going to show you is just, rather than looking at employment earnings, I'm going to see how much of this translates into increased consumption. You might think these households are residing in as ultra poor to begin with, so they have very low levels of consumption. We're seeing increases in consumption, both in terms of food consumption and non-food consumption. The majority of consumption for these households is related to food consumption. And so you're seeing increases in food consumption of around about 8% after 4 years of the program. So that has direct impacts on nutrition, well-being, and health of individuals in those households. But one thing I did want to emphasize is that the percentage increase in consumption is 8%. The percentage increase in earnings is closer to 12 or 15%. And that tells us, and we show this in the study, that some of the additional earnings are used for consumption, but some of them are also used for savings and investment to help these households build a greater set of assets or to invest in household related assets as well. And so what the programs are doing over a long period of time is allowing households to graduate out of poverty, both by allowing them to work to a greater extent, to accumulate earnings, to raise consumption, but also to use some of their earnings to reinvest into new forms of investment and to use as additional savings that may well turn out to be highly relevant when we're able to go back into the field and see how these households manage to cope with the current pandemic. And that may be quite different depending on whether they were initially given assets many years ago or whether they were given unconditional cash transfers. So let me just conclude there, and that's a brief overview of our findings comparing these two types of social protection program and how they impact graduation out of ultra poverty.
Thank you so much, Imran, for giving very nice presentation. I was just hoping that you will also present some finding on psychological well-being, because last year I heard your presentation when you are presenting your work at PPAF conference. You said you are looking for that part of thing also. So it's nice to learn. So I'll just give floor to Samia Liaquat with the two the key points. That one, while interviewing Qazi Isa, CEO PPAF, he said the real poverty is not the monetary poverty or the asset-based poverty. The real poverty is the sense of exclusion that people have. So they gave the example of Balochistan. So the rightly said they are basically feel they are excluded. And when I was interviewing the shapes of the one of the pioneer of this RSPN, they believe that this big push basically create a debt trap. So we have to be very like the rational when we are say that we have to give a big push to these poor people. With these two thoughts, I invite Samia to present what actually PPF has contributed to alleviate poverty and create a happy society for us. Thank you. Over to Samia.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nasir. Thank you to PIDE for hosting this event and for agreeing to be a joint host to this event, and to Dr. Imran for always, having had such a sort of long-term relationship with us now in terms of the very important research that you do around social protection and graduation. And this is the research that has really helped PPAF in develop its whole graduation strategy and approach. I will just share my screen if I can. And I hope everyone can see this. So I just want to talk a bit about PPF and our engagement in the whole graduation approach, which started off with a pilot that we did with, which was part of the global study on graduation. So it was using the BRAC livelihoods approach, which was targeting the ultra poor, where asset transfers were being provided to households, and with CGAP and IFAD, the International Fund for Agriculture Development, who supported us through financing this participation in this pilot. We initiated our sort of first effort in understanding how do households react better when they are provided with asset transfers. At this time, we were still in the process of the whole poverty scorecard surveying, so BISP had not yet started. So these assets were provided to households, and the households were identified, the poorest households were identified through participatory wealth rankings, through using from within the community mobilization approach. When the initial results came out in 2011-12, we had the midterm review come out, and this showed very good results to us in terms of the impact on households, on the treatment households that were provided with an asset which was equivalent to around 50,000 rupees. Most of these households did select to go for livestock, but there were statistically significant increases in consumption, income, and the overall asset base of these households. And similar to what Dr. Imran has shown you of the next kind of RCT that we were engaged in with him, where similar results have been coming to us. The initial pilot was targeting only 2,000 households, right? And we talked about, I think Dr. Shujaat talked about, what about going to scale? And this was very much on PPF's mind. How do we take a small pilot that is showing very good results, and how do we try and now replicate it across different union councils, different provinces in the country? And we were working currently with the World Bank at that time. It was a PPF3 project within which there was a livelihoods component. And we decided then that why don't we, given the success of this pilot, why don't we focus on, as part of the overall livelihoods approach, focus on providing assets to ultra poor households. During this time, we then did, BISP had already begun its operation, so they had started off in providing unconditional cash transfers to households. We used the poverty scorecard as the tool in which to objectively identify households with regard to their eligibility. BISP's targeting approach was, the cutoff for BISP was 16.17 on the poverty scorecard. So any household below that number was eligible to receive a social protection from BISP. with us, we had expanded this group a little bit. So we were we were engaging with households that ran the range of 0 to 18 on the poverty scorecard, because we felt that these were still households within this bracket were relatively the same, had the same sort of multidimensional aspects of poverty that we saw in the BISP households. And we provided 65,000 assets to households across the 4 provinces. And as part of this project, we had at that time also sort of engaged with Dr. Imran Rasul, with the Center for Economic Research in Pakistan, and we designed the asset versus cash transfer RCT, which Dr. Imran has just sort of shown you some of the results of. While the World Bank project was going on, we were looking at how can we now use this whole approach of graduation. What is the difference between the initial pilot and the way that we were working under the World Bank approach? And there were some differences, right? In the PPAF pilot that we did under BRAC, households received a kind of a 1-year kind of stipend allocation as part of the overall support that we were giving the households. They then received the asset that they had decided upon, and they also received some health benefits so they could use the local BHU. Under the World Bank project, we did not focus so much on BISP. So we were looking at households that were 0 to 18 on the scorecard, and they could be BISP or they didn't have to be BISP. So we did not focus on whether they were receiving a stipend, and we did not provide any stipend. We just provided the asset, and alongside the asset, we provided the asset training. So it was either business training or asset management training to households. And in 2016, when this project ended, we had the results from Imran as well, the initial sort of 2-year results on this. We also had our own sort of assessments and evaluations that the World Bank had conducted. And these were showing, again, a lot of beneficial impacts on households that had received the asset transfers. So this is what prompted PPAF to sort of move into sort of understanding that, okay, graduation is different to social protection, right? I think this is one of the key things where we looked at, yes, you have a program running, which is BISP, which is targeting 5 million households and providing a cash stipend on a quarterly basis. And as I think Dr. Shujaat showed, that this stipend does not have the effect of graduating households. Rather, it gives them sort of some allowance to fulfill their consumption requirements, but they continue to remain sort of in the ultra poor and poor categories. With us, when we were looking at providing assets, we were looking at this as a graduation approach, meaning that households who are provided assets, along with other sets of interventions, can potentially move out of the need for social protection. And this would be having a positive effect on also government investment in such kinds of social protection programs. So as we sort of looked at what our research was showing us, what the learnings were from the implementation of the project under PPF3 with the World Bank, we identified that there are certain sets of interventions that we can provide to households when they are moving up that poverty scorecard number. So for example, if I have given a household that is a BISP beneficiary, so under 16 on the scorecard, if we've provided them an asset and the relevant skills training, we believe that they would potentially, their poverty scorecard would rise. It could potentially go up to 18 or 20 or so. But alongside that, we realized that that's not so much enough for us, right? If we want to sustainably graduate households, we need to understand what are the kinds of demands households might have, and how can we meet this demand, as well as what is the kind of ecosystem that we need to create around that household that can enhance their ability to link up with mainstream markets and to really become, to develop the local economies. And so for this, we had put forward a number of supporting kinds of activities for those households that were provided the assets. Within a community, we also believed, we saw that there are households who might not be provided an asset, but who are maybe still within the poor category, who could potentially link up with households that we have provided assets to, form common interest groups or production centers, and engage in sort of be linked up with markets and with specific companies, etc., and can actually support the growth of the local economy in that sense. In 2015, the government had also come to us, and we had requested us to take forward a project that they wanted to do, a program around providing interest-free loans to the same ultra-poor households. We designed this interest-free loan scheme for them simply, mainly because PPF, when PPF started off, microfinance was the major focus, for the first I think 16 years of PPF. Microfinance was a major component of all our work. We built the microfinance sector. And then in 2016, we spun off the microfinance arm into a separate for-profit company called the Pakistan Microfinance Investment Company that is continuing to sort of provide, microfinance opportunities at a wholesale level through microfinance institutions and banks down to local individuals. So when this interest-free loan scheme came up, right, we kind of understood that there was a demand amongst our households, the ultra-poor households, for access to finance. And most of these ultra-poor households, when you look at, their ability to get financing, it was very limited, and it was very much linked to the areas they were working, where they were as aharis or as, as tenant farmers, where they would get loans from their landlords, or they would get loans from the local middlemen who are providing, by the provision of inputs into agri supplies. And this obviously was, high levels of interest were being charged around this. So one of the things that we looked at was, how do we actually support poor households? They've got an asset. They're, as Dr. Imran is saying, they're moving out of the daily wage labor into self-employment, potential entrepreneurship. They may and probably will have a need for financing. We don't believe that we should put the burden of regular microfinance on them yet, because we're not sure, with the interest charged by regular microfinance, how that would impact on their ability to repay and to really sustainably graduate. So there is a need to support such households with the provision of interest-free loans, as well as with trying to help them to access formal financial services such as insurance products, so for example, livestock insurance, or crop insurance, as well as for looking at how they can utilize those loans through providing relevant financial literacy trainings, etc., etc. So PPF slowly had was developing this graduation approach, and we felt that there were areas where once a household has gone through 2 or 3 potential sort of interventions for interest-free loans, where they might have reached a point where they require bigger loan sizes, that they can then approach regular microfinance, and that they are then sustainably have graduated for regular microfinance. So this was the kind of base on which we started working with donors as well as government to kind of look at how we can take forward our program, the asset transfers, and make it a long-term sustainable approach for ultra-poor households. Into 2017, IFAD came back to us, and together with them, we designed the National Poverty Graduation Program. And this was very much built on the learnings of the previous 8 to 9 years of having delivered asset transfers and of the research around that. And I'm just going to, before I move on to the rest of the slide, I'm just going to take you to the National Poverty Graduation Program. So basically within this, the idea was that approximately we would transfer funds to over 170,000 households in the form of assets, where we say tangible and intangible assets. By intangible assets, we also believe that vocational skills are very much now something that delivers a good return on the investment, and proper vocational trainings, which are certificate, where certificates are provided, can take the form of an asset. So it doesn't need to be a physical asset. Alongside that, we wanted to provide interest-free loans to households. And of these asset transfers, 60% of our target group was to be women, because we had looked at the BISP, the whole BISP approach as well, where all the grants are going towards women. And we felt that where this approach will be useful for women is where there is a mentoring as well of the household to ensure that women understand their ownership of the asset, that the household is involved in developing its own sort of livelihood investment plan to understand the skills and the resources that they currently have, and to better understand how that asset can be utilized for their benefit. So when we developed this program, we were, this was something where we felt that finally we can now start going to scale. All right, so it was 25 districts, nearly 400 union councils across Pakistan, nearly 200,000 households who we felt could graduate out of BISP. And this coincided also with the launch of the government's SR strategy, within which there was a National Poverty Graduation Initiative. That this is one of the initiatives under SRs. And under this, there are 3 areas, and all of these 3 areas are being managed by PPAF. One is the asset transfers, that's called Amdan. The vocational and skills training is also part of Amdan, and then the interest-free loans. And government, having seen some of the impacts also of the interest-free loans and the demand coming from communities for more loans, has committed a further 5 billion rupees to PPAF to expand our interest-free loan outreach. Currently, we're in 45 districts, and we hope to reach 100 districts once this additional financing comes to us across. Finally, I just want to talk to you a bit about the implementation, graduation in action. What is it that we've learned, and how is it that under NPGP, we really want to build up on this learning? And so what you see here is just a slide that shows you what are the different elements of our graduation program. And the initial 2 elements which you see on the left-hand side is the targeting and market value chain analysis. So one of the learnings has been that targeting is essential, right? And the correct targeting, ensuring that we are including the poorest households and not leaving out anyone, is critical for the success of this kind of a large-scale intervention. And while we have BISP data available to us, this data is now, it's now 10, 11 years old. So there have been a lot of changes in the country over the last 10, 11 years. So when we go into any district, into any union council, while we take our lead from using the BISP data, the old BISP data, we will always go down to the communities. We will engage with the community institutions. And this is one thing, mentoring community institutions is one of the fundamentals that we do wherever, whatever program we are working in. And we engage with the communities to undertake a participatory wealth ranking, where on the basis of what they consider poverty to be, who do they identify as the poorest households? And then we match what the community has identified as the poorest households with the original BISP data of households that were 0 to 18 on the BISP scorecard. And we then undertake a new survey for those households that are being identified by the community as well as by BISP to ensure that we are including the right set of people. And this is quite interesting because in certain parts of the country, there have been changes, right? So we are finding currently that in say certain parts of Sindh, 20 to 30% of households that were originally in the BISP data set have now graduated and are now moving out, have moved out of poverty, so they don't require the asset transfers anymore. But there is another maybe 15 to 20% new households that are being identified that were not there in the original BISP registry, NSCR registry. So those households are now being included. So targeting is essential. And alongside that, right, we need to get households to think about business, to think about what kind of occupations have the best impact on their ability to earn incomes and to sustainably earn these incomes. So we have started to undertake market and value chain assessments in districts to understand what could be the best kinds of productive assets for households to require. As part of this, there are households who continue to take the BISP allowance. When we start a project, we say that it would take, for us, we've realized that it's probably a 2-year period for households to graduate out of BISP, during which time having that BISP allowance for them would be relevant. After we do the targeting and the market value chain analysis, that takes the first 3 to 6 months. We then start the asset transfers, and alongside the asset transfers, we are also providing the relevant training and skills development. And one of the things we've also learned, right, is how do we really support households to move out of poverty, right? So one thing is for their incomes to increase by 20% or by 30%, and we set targets for ourselves. Another thing is to really understand, okay, what is the current situation we're in? And we have just done a baseline of our NPGP households, and we have seen that on average, their monthly earning is 12,000 rupees, right? We also see that in Pakistan, the current poverty line, based on the cost of basic needs approach, is around 24,000 rupees. And the national minimum wage has been defined as 17,500 rupees. So when we look at these numbers, we think to ourselves, okay, so for a household that is being provided an asset and is earning approximately 12,000 rupees before they've been provided with an asset, we want them to be able to move, over 2 years or over 3 years to above the poverty line of 24,000 rupees, right? So that would mean 100% increase in their salary or in their earnings, in their incomes. So if we are saying that, okay, our assets as they are given to any household gets a 20 to 30% increase in income, how do we actually keep building this up? And this is something with IFA that we have been working on as well as internally within PPF, as to the fact that we need to develop businesses. We need to develop business models at the community level. And these could be collective business models, but there has to be a focus on not just an asset, which could be livestock, but on actually a collection of households coming together and formalizing themselves into businesses to create local markets and to engage in the mainstream and the national markets. So I will leave it now as of this. I think I'm done for now and I'm out of time, and we can go on to questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. With one liner, I'll hand over mic to the Vice Chancellor to lead the discussion. So over the last 2 months, I have some experience with NBG beneficiaries. So of course, they are very much benefited from these type of asset transfer, and the asset transfer to some extent provides like a cushion to sustain from these type of pandemic. So with this, I'll request Dr. Nadeem to please carry on.
Thank you, Nasir Saab. Thank you, Imran. Thank you to everybody, Samia and Shujaat. I think we've had a great session. Number of good thoughts and ideas have come up. I'll now quickly move to the floor and let people ask questions. Zia Bande.
So just to add a one line, Professor Imran left because he has some urgent meeting with someone.
Okay.
So we are left with Simon and Shujaat.
Understood.
Okay. Can I put up a question, Dr. Sam?
Please go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, most of this discussion, what I feel is focus on rural poverty. When you're talking about these livestock, it's concerned with the rural poverty. I just need to understand that exactly what is the strategy on the urban poverty side for the PPF. And second thing, which I was very intrigued, which you did talk about in the very last, Dr. Samia, she did talk about these community linkages, these community institutions, the collective. Now, how that collective is going to work, I mean to say what sort of a research, because that's what we have seen also when we are talking about these microfinance institutions. Obviously, they have a high cost of funds. So in Pakistan, on average, they are charging 38 to 40% per annum, the interest rate. So that's quite high, how they are going to sustain themselves. And when you are talking about these development linkages, and you did talk about that the government has set aside 5 billion rupees to be distributed into 3.8 million new borrowers. Now, up till now, you have basically, what your figures you are telling us, 282,000 loans have been extended, the interest-free loans. Now, 3.8 million means that you are going to increase it by over 1,000 times. That's a very ambitious target. And when if I divide the 5 billion rupees onto 3.8 million, it comes around 1,315 rupees. So I just want to understand that what are the additional sources you guys are looking into it, where you can generate that much interest-free loans, which are sustainable also. Because in Pakistan, if you look at the total microfinance portfolio, it's about 12 to 13%, which are interest-free. The majority is interest-based. So I just need to understand these dynamics, that how you guys have planned to work out. And a word on the urban poverty. Thank you.
Thank you. Samia, can you please just note these questions? We can take a few minutes.
I've noted them.
Karam Saab?
Yes, hello, अस्सलाम वालेकुम।
जी
जी मैंने ये पूछना था कि जो ये आप लोगों का जो रिलीफ वर्क जो है, ठीक है, इसमें पॉलिटिकल जो लाइन जो है उसको कैसे सेपरेट कर सकती हैं, क्योंकि जो पॉलिटिकल जो मार्जिन है उसको सेपरेट करना इट्स वेरी डिफिकल्ट, ठीक है। और जो बेनजीर इनकम सपोर्ट प्रोग्राम जो है, ठीक है, वो फॉर्म्स वगैरह तो डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हो जाते हैं, लेकिन उनकी जो रीइंबर्समेंट्स जो हैं दे आर टोटली पॉलिटिकल on political grounds, ठीक है। Same goes to other areas as well. Or for like one other like important thing I want to add, थोड़ी सी information आप लोगों को देना चाहूँगा कि 2010 I was working as the president of social welfare wing of PTI Rawalpindi, ठीक है। At that time we were only a few members of PTI, okay. And at that time we tried our best to distribute these basically this support program forms, but we couldn't get the reimbursements. So how would you like separate this political line? Okay.
Hello.
Thank you. That's all I would say.
Okay, next question. Ram Ali, please make.
जी अस्सलाम वालेकुम, गोराम अली बात कर रहा हूँ। बहुत अच्छी प्रेजेंटेशन थी। मेरा एक सवाल है कि जो बिस्प के बेनिफिशरीज हैं, अगर वो जा रहे हैं कहीं पे कैश करवाने सारी, तो उनसे 1000 और 500 पे जो है ना पर बेनिफिशरीज लिया जाता है। तो क्या ऐसी कोई है हमारे पास जहाँ हम इसको रोक सकें, ताकि उन लोगों को प्रॉपर वे में जो है ना वो चीज़ें ऑन दी डोर मिल जाएं और उनको जो है ना वो वहाँ पे जाके बहुत बड़ी रश में वो सारी चीज़ें ख्वार ना होना पड़े। थैंक यू।
Thank you so much. So with my question, I'll hand over to Samia for the answer of the question. So when we are looking into the very comprehensive approach, as you mentioned in the one of the slides, that you are adding additional intervention within the package, then the issue is the implementation, how we can adjust the cost of this whole intervention. Because when I was discussing with the Ben and the Rima from MIT about the new approaches looking into the graduation. So they raised this concern of the hand holding where there is a huge cost involved. Over to Samia.
Yeah, thank you. Lots of very difficult questions, so I hope I shall try and do my best. I think in terms of when we look at urban poverty, right, and what is the strategy, you're right, it has to be a very different strategy to the rural poverty strategy. And with PPAF, we mainly work in rural development, right? So our strategies are very much focused on rural areas. However, there is learning in terms of how one can move forward and to develop a strategy around urban poverty. And one of the big things in Pakistan, right, around urban poverty is the fact that the poverty can be even more entrenched and deeper and more difficult because you do not have that kind of social support network that you might have in the rural areas. But in terms of the pluses, the fact is that the opportunity for vocational trainings, for linking to jobs and linking to the demand that is there in the market, and for technological enhancements to support that vocational training and linkage to jobs, that is very much there in the urban centers, and it is not there in the rural areas. And I think any urban strategy, urban poverty strategy needs to understand, because you have a youth bulge, there is a huge kind of youth group within urban centers. They have to be addressed, and this has to be addressed through, I feel, the kind of vocational and technical skills training and the linkages with actual employment opportunities or self-employment. So I will leave it over there, because I'm sure Dr. Nadeem and PIDE have already done many webinars on some of these opportunities in urban areas, and they can expand more on this topic. In terms of the second question, which was around business collectives, right, and development linkages. So this is something that is definitely new, and for us, we understand poverty and poverty alleviation practices from a development sector perspective, but things need to change. And I think this is really, there has to be a paradigm shift in development. The old ways don't really work much longer. So we need to engage in understanding what is the kind of entrepreneurial business side of this kind of collective that needs to be supported to grow, because it is only through the creation of local markets that you are going to be able to have the right kind of opportunities for jobs, for entrepreneurship, and for sustainably supporting people to live, to earn an income, and to move out of poverty. When we talk about collectives here, we look at currently, I'll give you an example, right? We are working in Job in Balochistan, and we are working with a lot of community villagers who are growing horticulture products like garlic and onions. Now we have done some market research where we realize there is a big demand in the closer urban centers to them for the dried garlic and the dried onions. So there is an opportunity to take a product, to add value to it, to support them through a system of grants and loans, to support these households to come together to form a business collective, to get the right machinery, to be trained on doing the drying of the garlic and the onions, as well as to support them around branding and packaging, and then link them up to the market so that they can actually develop this business proposition. We are doing a lot of work also with certain of our communities around dairy, right? So the provision of livestock is very much in most asset transfer programs. You find that in the rural areas, people prefer livestock. And so if you have in a community, if you have 50 cows or 30 cows or whatever, the setting up of a dairy cooperative that can be provided with chillers, that can be supported to look at what are the byproducts of dairy, ghee, for example, or butter, or other things which can be sold, which can be packaged and sold in the local markets as well as in the local urban centers. These are areas that we are really trying to support through providing this kind of value chain development, looking at doing market assessments, providing support, business development support to these households, so professional business development support and formalizing their businesses, so getting them registered as businesses and guiding and mentoring them in all the aspects of business that will lead to the end product. So again, this is something relatively new for PPF that we're doing, but we realize that for us, it's not enough to just now provide an asset and say, okay, we've provided an asset to a household, let's move on. There is a whole, you need socioeconomic development, and that means empowerment as well. Empowerment of individuals, empowerment of the family, empowerment of women within those communities. And given you've seen the education statistics that Dr. Shujaat has shown, where you're still, way behind. In Balochistan, only 9% of girls are moving into high school education or whatever. So there is a need for a socio-economic empowerment at the household level and at the community level. And this does very much tie into the last question that was asked to me about the issue of implementation and cost effectiveness. And yes, it is more cost effective to hand someone 5,000 rupees or 100,000 rupees than it is to have a system in place where you are doing this hand-holding, mentoring, and you are consistently engaging with a household over a period of 2 years to help them sustainably graduate. But this is a cost question in terms of, that government maybe needs to really mull over to understand that if we really want to provide, if we want to address multidimensional poverty, and not just income poverty, there is a need to use this kind of mentoring approach. And that is my personal perspective. And of course, everyone can have their own perspectives. And when we talk about cost effectiveness, right, the idea is that you are moving out of social protection. So instead of having those 5 million households on your roster, continuously year after year after year, and that may be growing to 7 million households or 10 million households, the graduation approach means that you invest more, at the beginning, with the idea that after 1 or 2 years, you do not have that household remaining on the registry. And then the last thing in terms of politicization, so I don't work with BISP. So in terms of, and I've heard, yes, that, that there are middlemen who will take 500 rupees or whatever, but I think Dr. Shujaat could potentially, respond on that. In terms of politicization, right, one of the things where you have strong targeting and where you have very objective methodology and means of verification of targeting, you can move away from politicization, right? You can actually prevent politicization because you have criteria, you have objectively verifiable criteria against which households are identified, and that is what allows them to get the asset. Thank you very much.
I will enhance the point that has been made by Samia Khan. Regarding last two questions on political margins as well as bribes. I think good thing is that every successive government is owning the BISP. As I have mentioned earlier, that every government have allocated more budget. It was started with 18 billion and right now its budget is more than 207 billion. And second thing is that this data that is called Poverty Scorecard or National Socio-Economic Registry, this data has been used by every provincial government, irrespective of what is the political affiliation. You know that this data was collected in 2010-11, but Punjab Social Protection Authority used this data. Even KP Insaf card that used the data in last political regime, and even your Sehat Sahulat program, etc., etc. All these programs are using this data. So good thing is that we have a single registry, and that has been widely accepted by all the provincial governments, whatever their affiliations. Yes, we have certain targeting issues. Like, for example, as I have mentioned earlier, that this is a static registry. It was updated in 2010-11. You know that right now social Sehat Sahulat program is expanding in the country. Recently Prime Minister have launched in AJK and Experta, but still we are using this old 2010-11 data for targeting in 2021. And second, I think we have not learned a lot to improve this registry. BISP started to update this registry in 2016, and still BISP is struggling to update this registry. So this is more than 5 years that still we are unable to update this registry, but previously in 2010-11, this registry was updated just in 1 year. Second, regarding bribes, this is an operational question. You know that since I worked with PISP, BISP have made a lot of effort in improving in payment disbursement system. In 2008-9, it was Pakistan Post Office. Yes, it was giving payment at the doorsteps, but it was entirely the manual system. And then BISP gave the debit card to its beneficiaries. Around 5 million beneficiaries received debit card. But again, this was the challenge that these beneficiaries were quite illiterate. They don't know that how to operate the ATM and use this debit card. And there was huge replacement rate. I think more than 15 lakh card, 1/3 card, they have been replaced over the last 5 years. And recently, BISP has introduced a new payment system. I think right now it is quite innovative payment solution. It's totally the cardless payment system. This is biometric payments, where the beneficiary just required biometric live verification from the NADRA database. And yes, there was bribes because there was middleman, because the payments were made on point of sale. But recently, BISP has made one good effort that now we have 80 biometric machines at the ATM points. So where beneficiaries can go and they can use these ATM machines where they can get payment through biometric verification. So I think it's quite good that where there is a lot of financial inclusion, and at least woman herself has to go to receive the payment. So it will enhance the financial inclusion.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Shujaat. So there is a question. So is there any question from someone?
Assalamu alaikum ji, if I may be allowed to make a few comments. My name is Mehwish Mahmood. I'm a University of Cambridge graduate, and my final year thesis had a component of microfinance in it. And I was given a chance to study both the Grameen Bank model as well as the Kashyap Foundation model. So my question is that merely assuming that a credit mechanism with a high, let's say in this case, there's no repayment rate, but it does have an outreach element to it, which has an empowering effect on women borrowers. And my research shows that this could be a naive approach for those seeking a larger, effective, sustainable strategy to poverty alleviation. So have we looked into that? Because women empowerment through microfinance, through as far as my research shows, is not really sort of working out for a lot of different countries. So is there like a cross-country analysis that we are going to keep in mind before we actually start implementing it nationwide? Thank you very much.
If you allow, let me respond on this.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Mehwish, yes, you're very right, Mehwish. I think even in Pakistan, we see the results of microfinance. It's not the silver bullet that it initially, was sort of lauded to be. And it has to be used wisely. And I think it has to be used keeping in mind what are the experiences, not only within Pakistan, but elsewhere. One of the things that when PPAF started its microfinance program, we were very clear that microfinance was not for the ultra poor, right? We had seen the effects in India of the mass suicides of farmers, etc., and in other countries where, giving very poor households, very poor farmers loans with heavy repayment schedules and heavy interest wasn't resulting in much success. And yes, even when it comes directly to women, so providing loans to women, we've done some research with Ghazala Mansouri of the World Bank on loans and training and the impact on women and men and the uptake of loans by women and men. This was around 2010-11. We found that actually women were not really benefiting from the loans. Right, even though they were the ones taking out the loans. And so we had to move away from looking at numbers to actually looking at what can we do when it comes to supporting women's empowerment. How does this work? Is just providing a loan is not enough in itself, right? You require other activities, you require other mentoring for households that actually engages women, looks at the kind of work women are doing. So what is their labor force participation? What is the kind of activity that they would invest the money in before we sort of, engage with them in giving them a loan? And this has helped us in terms of trying to ensure that that there is empowerment, that women's decision making within the household when it comes to the loan is not taken out of their hands, but that they are trying to participate and that they do participate in that decision making. Overall, the idea of interest-free loans, so there is a 95% repayment rate, and there is a question that I missed out in terms of the loan size. The average loan size is around 30,000 rupees, and this is a revolving fund, right? So when we talk about 5 billion rupees or the initial 3.1 billion rupee investment, that means that this money goes in every year. It is being revolved once or twice. So, right now we have, in terms of actual sort of, if we look at the number of loans since 2015, I think we have reached up to, say, around 10 billion rupees in terms of when you look at all of the different revolving loans. So I don't want to belabor the fact, but yes, there is definitely room for improvement. And I agree with your points. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else, Ji? Challenge. One very quick question, ये बताइए साइमा बीबी कि अपना वो समिया सॉरी कि अपना PRSP has been doing microfinance and community development for, I guess, over 30 years now. Has any evaluation of that been done? Because you're moving into roughly the same territory, aren't you?
When you say PRSP? You mean the Punjab Rural Support Program, or?
There are 5 of them, the national.
Yes, all of them. So we finance them, right? We've been financing a lot of their work. So their microfinance had, I think they were supported, they started out with getting money from PPAF through our various, projects and programs. And then as they moved along, like for example, NRSP then went and launched its own bank, right? So now you have NRSP Bank, which is looking after the microfinance and has separated out. So similarly, we have the PMIC, which we have spun off as a separate arm for us. In terms of assessments and evaluations, we have had some assessments. We had 2 IFAD funded projects which are focused on microfinance, right? Over the period 2007 to maybe 2015 or 14. And a lot of the evaluations kind of had some good sort of impacts coming out. But we, there was some increase in incomes of households, but there wasn't anything which really stood out. And there were certain, I would say, maybe, it wasn't the silver bullet that they were expecting it to be in terms of getting households out of poverty. So it wasn't really having an impact on the target audience that they wanted to have an impact on.
Right. So there are right now a number of agencies, I mean, at least 4 or 5 that I know of. I mean, NRSP, PRSP, and then yourself and BISP. There's so many agencies working on poverty, and the World Bank has this mission for ending poverty. I mean, does anybody calculate the overhead of this work? I mean, is there a huge amount of overhead for the delivery? And at the same time, you mentioned Ghazala Mansouri, and you're absolutely right, but it's very interesting that when poverty decreased, the World Bank raised the line. So in a sense, it seems that the poverty is a moving target, or is it a fixed target? I mean, in a sense.
Well, I mean, if you look at the World Bank, so initially it was the whole, their definition of poverty is very much income-based, right? And our definition with PPF, when we look at poverty, we look at it, maybe we take on board the Amartya Sen kind of version of poverty, where it is about having the opportunity, right? It's the lack of opportunity and the lack of options. And that comes from a number of things. It comes from no proper education system, poor access to healthcare, and all of those things that deepen the sort of the poverty of a household. So yes, I think the World Bank changed from income poverty to cost of basic needs approach, right? So initially it was caloric consumption that they looked at. What is the level of poverty? How do you define it based on caloric consumption? And they moved over to cost of basic needs assessment. And that increased your poverty levels a bit. But on the whole, the World Bank does keep saying that poverty has been reducing significantly over the years. And so if you look at the last 20, 30 years, you see that there is this huge dip in poverty. And in the last few years, it's like it had gone down to 10%, I think, and then now it's gone back up to maybe 20% or 21%. We are all doing a lot on poverty, and I'll be very honest. PPAF is an apex organization. We fund a lot of the RSPs and other civil society organizations working on poverty alleviation. But we still have only, there are, say, 6,500 union councils in Pakistan. We are in maybe 1,000 or 50, maximum 1,500 union councils. So however much we're trying to do, we're still only managing to reach out to 20% of the country, right? I feel it is government's responsibility at the end of the day. Government is the only machinery that really has access to really support the entire population. And the reason that government is looking to PPAF and looking to some of these other agencies as a way to support them is because when we do get funds from them, the work that we are doing is kind of supporting the government's efforts, their poverty alleviation strategy, their efforts towards social protection is being supported by us trying to graduate households out of poverty. But then you also look at population growth, right? And you look at the impact of population growth on any kind of poverty alleviation kind of programs. It's very tough. It's very tough to even just keep, to manage to keep the same pace with population growth. So there are lots of macroeconomic areas that need to be also looked at when we have when we are looking at poverty alleviation. What kind of strategy do we need? We need to look at inflation. We need to look at rural versus urban inflation. We need to look at migration. The cities are just overflowing, and there's huge opportunity cost of that for this country. So it's a very long discussion.
Well, there's another interesting. Obviously, all discussions are long, and they should be. There's another interesting question that comes to mind. That the analyses that we've done, and many others have done, for example, Ghazali in Lahore has shown, and Arif Hassan, etc., that Pakistan is now largely an urban country. In fact, estimates suggest, using satellite data, Pakistan may be as much as 70%, 80% urbanized. And the rural areas are dwindling, and dwindling very rapidly. But yet there's a huge amount of focus on rural poverty. In the urban areas, there's also poverty. And one initiative that we've taken, which is kind of hopefully attracted Samia Nishta's attention and may receive attention, I hope so, is the urban poverty, especially as it comes to street vending. Now, you guys are giving assets to the rural people to do business. Now, street vending, the courts have declared street vending to be illegal, and they're throwing these people out. They're regarded as encroachers. So basically, the courts have thrown a few 100,000 people into poverty in Karachi and Islamabad and places. Yet we can't seem to get a street vending framework going in the government. We are talking about it. Long time, we've been talking about it for 20 years now. Is that something that PPAF or you people would be interested? Because this is a homegrown initiative. It doesn't come out of Cambridge or Harvard or something. So what about the homegrown initiatives and things like this?
I think homegrown initiatives are probably the best, right? It's the initiative that comes. I mean, this paradigm shift in development, it is coming from a younger generation who believes that they want to do enterprise, they want to work, they want to make a profit, but they want to help. They want to help others. And I think that is a different mindset to what we in the development sector have been doing for the last 20 years, which is donor money coming in, and then it's sort of like supply driven kind of, poverty alleviation. So we need to take on board like these kinds of startups and social enterprises and opportunities, as you are saying, that can build a new kind of base, right? A new kind of economic base in this country. And I do think with you that there is a serious, I think there is a serious intellectual crisis here, in the sense that we look outside sometimes and we look around, but we're not really seeing what it is that can really benefit our own people. We don't, I think it's a structural, the structural inequalities that exist, right? We don't really hear the voices of the poor. We don't want to. We're too busy looking up, and I think that shift needs to happen. So I think Qazi Saab is here. Maybe he can tell you. But I would love to work on urban poverty.
Where is Qazi?
I thought he was here. I'd seen him earlier on.
I tried to find him. I couldn't find him.
Maybe he's
a few words. Disappeared, huh? Okay.
Yeah, I think he might have left.
We will live that interview very soon. So there was very insightful discussion with Qazi Saab. Probably we will also include our upcoming magazine, all those like insights from Qazi Saab. And probably we will be in a position to arrange a specific webinar on Qazi Saab's thought in the near future.
Zarur, absolutely. Well, ji, thank you very much. Samia, thank you. Thank you, Shujaat Saab. Thank you, Imran, in absentia. I know academics are very busy. Samia, we are also the poor of Pakistan, unheard, the PIDE and the universities of Pakistan. Nobody listens to them. Nobody cares about what they do. But yet, we've been talking about street vending and opportunities for the poor for a long time. But that's the way the landscape is structured. The donors have the money. We don't have the money to pay our salaries. But nevertheless, we'll continue to try and learn, continue to try and think. And the whole idea of this webinar is really to give students an opportunity to learn and think. So I'm very glad that you came and you educated our students on what's happening. And I'm sure that many of them will make a research topic out of this. Maybe they'll do a thesis, maybe they'll do something. So if they come to you with data or help, please help them do it, because our poverty work really is to try and get our students thinking and involved in some work and reduce our reliance on the donors, which they have created this huge paraphernalia of policy making that I don't know how we can challenge, but we'll try and do that. So this is the David and Goliath approach. David is losing badly at the moment, but doesn't matter. We'll get it right. Thank you very much, folks. Great pleasure. We'll do something again soon. Whole point is to collaborate and learn together, and we will continue to do that. Thank you. Thank you very much. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.